and I came out and I just put the script on Kent's desk and said, "You want to do this, and we want you to do this." So we're very, very happy that we're here. Because of the incredible PR wing here at the Denver Center, many of you have probably heard some of the stories about how I came to be the person to revise the Unsinkable Molly Brown. But in thinking about it this morning, it occurred to me that there's actually a preamble to it. And it begins in the early 90s when I had this idea to adapt the movie Thoroughly Modern Millie for the stage. And I somehow found out who controlled the rights, the original screenwriter, Richard Morris, and I had his address that he had registered when he'd finished the script in 1964, and I called information and got his phone number, and I dialed, and he actually picked up the phone. And I told him, you know, my name is Dick Scanlan, and I said what I wanted to do, why I wanted to do it, and why I was the perfect person to do it, and he hung up on me. I would call him, and I'd write him, and I'd have lawyers write him, agents write him, and he just kept saying no, no, no. And in one of those phone calls, as he was hanging up on me, he screamed that he was revising it himself. He was adapting himself for the stage. He didn't need my help. So after a few years of that, I decided to lie. And I wrote him a letter telling him that I was coming to Los Angeles on business, and I just didn't tell him that he was the business. And I said I wanted to be a sounding board for him so that he could bounce ideas off me for his, you know, thrilling adaptation of Thoroughly Modern Millie. And lo and behold, he responded to that. He very cautiously invited me to his home, and I went and I met with him. We had a 6-hour meeting, and by the end of that meeting, we had decided to journey forth together and collaborate on that show. Richard died fairly early on in that process, but while we were working on it, one day he looked at me and he said, "Listen, when we're done fixing Millie, we have to fix Molly." And he gave me the script to read, and I read it. And I just didn't respond to it. It just wasn't an aesthetic that worked for me, and I couldn't figure out how to make the story something that would be playable for a contemporary audience. So Richard passed away, and some years later, his trustee, Diana Maitland, who's with us tonight, called me and asked me again, would you consider revising Unsinkable Molly Brown? And again, I read the script, and again, I just couldn't see how to do it. And I said, I'm so sorry, you know, I love you and I loved Richard, but I just can't figure it out. So some years later, I was at my desk in my office in my home, and Freddie Gershon, who runs Music Theater International, called me and said, "Hey Dick, we get a lot of requests to look at the Unsinkable Molly Brown material, and when people look at it, they don't pick up on it. They decide not to do it. Do you think you could punch it up a bit, revise it, what have you?" And I said, "You know, Freddie, I know the piece really well, and I can't find a way to love it. It's just not for me." And I said, "I'm so sorry," and I hung up the phone, and I turned to a writer who I was working with on a project, and I said to her, "I feel like Molly Brown is always hanging over my head." And she reached over my head and took off a picture I have hung there of Richard Morris underneath the original marquee of the Unsinkable Molly Brown, and she said, "You hung it over your own head." So maybe you're supposed to think about this. So I called Freddie back, and I said, "Give me 6 months to see if there's any way I could love this. If I could figure out a way to love it, I'll do it." And for 5 of those 6 months, I really struggled trying to study the original script and really listen to the score, and I responded to a lot of the score very, very much, and I just couldn't figure out a way to do it. And so finally, in sort of great panic, because the 6 months was coming to an end, and I had promised Freddie I'd have some idea to put forth for him, and I never want to disappoint him. I came out to Colorado to research because I thought perhaps if I understood how they created this story, I'd have a better insight as to how to shore it up a bit. And of course, as all of the people here who are native Coloradans know, the moment you begin to scratch the surface of Molly Brown, what you immediately find out is that there are really 2 Molly Browns. There's a mythological Molly Brown that was created right after her death in a series of obituaries, and then a book that came out a few years later that is virtually made up. It's just absolute made up, very fanciful stuff that contains the essence of this character, and then there's the actual person. And that seemed very, the person really excited me. really, really excited me. She was dynamic, she was committed to social change, she really believed in extending to other people the opportunities that she had had, and all those qualities, her generosity, her sort of go out and do itness were also the things that created problems for her in her marriage and in her life in general. And I felt very, very connected to that. And sort of thinking about it today, what occurred to me is, you know, essentially Richard was so pig-headed when I was reaching out to him, and then I was so pig-headed when people were reaching out to me. And I think that, you know, another sort of the libertarian word for pig-headedness is rugged individualism. And I think that one of the things that the play is sort of set on top of is this, it's a love story. That's really how we've conceived it, fundamentally a love story between Margaret Tobin Brown and James Joseph Brown. But it's set against this kind of this soil of this symbiosis between rugged individualism and community, both of which play a big part in this revision. And I think about, you know, how strong-minded I was initially in terms of not wanting to do it, and then having this idea that was so wholly reimagined, and having to call Diana Maitland, and having to call Rosemary Wilson, Meredith's widow, who was alive at the time, Tom Camp, Al Pivo, her trustees, and say to them, guys, I think I'd like to do this, but I'd like to start over. I want to do it 100%. I want to begin again. And to be able to have those sorts of hard conversations with them and have them come aboard and say yes to that. And then to come here and meet Kent and Charles and Dan Ritchie and have them really, really embrace this, and along the way to be partnered with Bob Greenblatt, who's been an extraordinary champion of this piece from the moment we were sort of set up by George Lane, and from the moment we met, we sort of saw what it could be together, and sort of taking this journey. And then sort of the two most important phone calls I made sort of at the same time. The first to Michael Rafter, our music director, who's been a longtime collaborator of mine, whose taste, whose incredible musicality and whose candor is something I've really come to rely on in all projects that I do. And then to Kathleen Marshall, our director choreographer, who we don't really know when we met, because I actually went to college with her brother in the town where she lives. So somewhere when she was in her teens, we were at a birthday party or something together. And over the years, we've come to know each other socially, but this was the first time we've worked together, and it's been really extraordinary. Kathleen was suggested to me when I knew her work very well, but when I was looking for a director early on, it was my partner Alan Efron who said, you should call Kathleen Marshall, and here's why. She's the smartest person out there directing this kind of musical. She never apologizes for old-fashioned musicals, and it would be really thrilling to have a woman at the helm of this. And as always, Alan was right. You know, they say write what you know, and to the extent this was a love story, I could only write it because I've lived it for 18 years. And I just want to close by saying that I feel really transformed by the experience of working on this show. And one of the things that's really changed in my life is that Margaret Tobin Brown was a real philanthropist, as you'll see in the show. And all of that is indeed very, very true. In so many ways, she affected so many causes in profound ways. And since sort of taking on the mantle of revising this show, I've really expanded my philanthropic activities. You know, I used to just go to the occasional benefit and maybe write a check, which is very helpful. But I've actually sort of started doing various things. And every year I go to Africa to work at this place over there. And there's this, the basic ethical concept in sub-Saharan Africa is called Ubuntu. And that's this idea. There's a lot of different ways to articulate it, but one way is to say, I am a person because of other people, or you can say, if I'm telling my story and you're not here to hear it, then I'm not really telling it. And that both the person listening and the person telling it are of equal importance in that relationship. And I feel really grateful that the Denver Center, that Bob, that my collaborators Kathleen, Rafter, that the trustees, Diana, Tom, Al, Rosemary, who's no longer with us, that Freddie Gershon became this community against which I could sort of, you know, exercise my rugged individualism / pig-headedness to bring this to fruition. And I hope that a lot of that spirit is something you'll experience when you see the show tonight. And I thank you for all your support. You're an amazing city. Our whole company's fallen in love with it. And Kent asked me the other day, well, how can we do better? And I said, and Dan Ritchie asked me the same thing. I said, the only way I think you can do better is by realizing how good you are. Yeah. Because we work in a lot of theaters, Kathleen and Rafter, and so we have a basis of comparison, and I'm telling you, the level of talent, professionalism, craftsmanship, not to mention kindness and compassion, is off the charts here. And we had a strong hunch that would be the case, but for it to become true the way it has is very gratifying. So thank you all very much.